Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Aranther as Kale pulled his hood tighter around his face. The once thriving city, now reduced to a shadow of its former self, mirrored the state of his soul. Crumbling buildings leaned precariously over the streets, and flickering lanterns cast pale shadows across his path. The world felt muted, colors washed out, as if even the air was tired of existing. But Kale had a mission, one last chance to undo the greatest mistake of his life. It had been years since the battle that destroyed everything he held dear. Kale, once a fierce warrior of the Blackthorn Brotherhood, had watched as his comrades fell one by one, outmaneuvered and outgunned by the ruthless Silver Legion. Their defeat wasn't just a military loss, it was the end of a way of life. Since then, he had lived in the shadow of his failure, haunted by the screams of his brothers, the looks of betrayal in their eyes as they realized he had led them into a trap. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the present. Regret wouldn't change the past. Only the phantom blade could do that. Whispers of the blade's power had reached his ears in the aftermath of the battle, tales of a weapon that could slice through the fabric of time itself. Legend said that the one who mastered it could walk through time, altering events, shaping reality to their will. Kale had searched for years, following every lead, every scrap of information, until finally, he had learned of its location, a forgotten temple hidden deep in the mountains of Eldarim. Now, after months of dangerous travel, Kale stood on the brink of seizing the one thing that could give him what he desired most, a second chance. He stopped at the base of the mountain, staring up at the jagged peaks. The temple was hidden somewhere among those cliffs, guarded by ancient forces that had long since faded into myth. But Kale wasn't afraid of myths. He had faced worse, far worse. His heart was cold, his soul hardened by years of loss and pain. There was nothing left to fear. He began the ascent. Hours passed as Kale climbed, the air growing thinner, colder with each step. The mountain seemed determined to defeat him before he even reached the temple, as if testing his resolve. But Kale pushed forward, his breath ragged but steady. His mind, sharp as ever, replayed the events of the battle again and again, searching for the precise moment where everything had gone wrong. If he could just get back to that instant, if he could just make a different choice, everything would be different. Finally, as the last light of day faded into dusk, Kale reached the temple. It stood at the edge of a cliff, its weathered stone walls barely visible through the thick mist that swirled around it. The entrance was unguarded, just as the legend had said. No living soul had entered the temple in centuries, none who had entered had ever returned. Kale stepped forward, his heartbeat steady, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. The temple doors creaked open at his touch, revealing a long, dark corridor that led into the heart of the mountain. With a deep breath, Kale entered, the heavy doors closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the chamber. The air inside was thick with the weight of centuries, the musty smell of decay clinging to every surface. Faint whispers seemed to drift from the walls, voices from long ago warning him of the dangers that lay ahead. But Kale wasn't deterred. He had come too far to turn back now. At the end of the corridor, a faint light flickered from an open chamber. Kale moved toward it, his eyes adjusting to the dim glow. As he entered the room, he saw it, a sword, floating in the center of the chamber, suspended in midair as if held by invisible hands. The phantom blade. It was smaller than he had imagined, its sleek, blackened steel almost unremarkable compared to the ornate weapons he had seen in his travels. But there was something about it, something that hummed with power, as though time itself vibrated within its edge. Kale reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the hilt. The moment his fingers made contact with the cold steel, the world around him shifted. Colors blurred, sounds warped, and for a moment, Cale felt himself being pulled in every direction at once. His mind fractured, splintering into 1,000 different realities, each one tugging at him, trying to pull him under. He fought against the disorientation, gripping the sword tighter. The chaos slowly subsided, leaving him standing in the chamber, but the world felt different. His heart raced as he realized what had just happened. He had crossed the threshold of time. With a deep breath, Cale steadied himself. He could feel the power of the phantom blade thrumming through his veins, a connection between him and the very fabric of existence. This was it. The power to change the past. Without hesitation, Cale thought of the battle, the moment it all went wrong. He focused on that instant. The image of his comrades falling burned into his mind, and he swung the blade. The world around him twisted once again, and when it settled, Cale found himself standing in the midst of the battlefield. It was just as he remembered, the chaos, the screams, the smell of blood and fire. But something was different. Cale looked around, his eyes scanning the battlefield, and froze when he saw himself. Across the field, a younger version of Cale was leading the charge, his face set with determination, unaware of the trap that awaited him. Cale's heart pounded in his chest. This was his chance. He could warn his past self, change the course of history. He started toward the younger Cale, but before he could reach him, the world shifted again. Cale blinked, disoriented as the battlefield faded, replaced by another scene. He was no longer at the battle. He was in a village, watching as a version of himself tended to crops, a peaceful smile on his face. This Cale had never gone to war. He had chosen a different path, a life without violence or vengeance. But as Cale watched, the peaceful life crumbled. The village was raided, the crops burned, and this version of himself was powerless to stop it. The same sense of failure returned. Even in this alternate timeline, the blade's power surged, and once again Cale was pulled into another reality. Each time he swung the blade, he found himself in a different version of his past, each one shaped by different choices. In one, he had fled the battle entirely, living a life of shame and cowardice. In another, he had become a merciless warlord, driven by vengeance to conquer, but in doing so, lost his humanity. Each version of himself that he encountered was flawed, broken in its own way. And with each leap through time, Cale began to realize that no matter what choice he made, the outcome was never what he expected. The past was never as simple as he remembered. By the time Cale returned to the present, he was exhausted, his mind fractured by the countless timelines he had experienced. The phantom blade, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a curse. He had been so focused on changing the past, on undoing his failure, that he hadn't realized the cost. Every change he made rippled through time, creating consequences he couldn't foresee, consequences that only led to more pain. Cale collapsed to his knees, the blade slipping from his hand. He had been a fool. There was no way to fix the past. No matter how many times he tried, no matter how many versions of himself he encountered, the outcome was always the same. The only difference was how much he was willing to sacrifice. Tears burned in Cale's eyes as he stared at the blade. For so long, he had been driven by guilt, by the belief that if he could just change one thing, he could undo all the pain. But now he saw the truth. The past was unchangeable, a fixed point in time that could not be rewritten, but that didn't mean he was powerless. The phantom blade wasn't about changing the past, it was about controlling the future. The power it gave him wasn't a gift to alter what had been, but a tool to shape what was to come. Cale stood, his body weak but his mind clearer than it had been in years. He picked up the blade, feeling its weight in his hand. It no longer felt like a burden. Cale stood, the weight of the phantom blade resting in his hand, but this time, it felt different. The oppressive weight of expectation and regret had lifted, replaced by a newfound clarity. He no longer looked to the past with longing, nor to the future with fear. He was here, in this moment, and he alone had the power to wield the blade, not as a tool to rewrite history, but as a means to carve out his own path forward. The cold night air stung his cheeks as he stepped out of the temple and into the moonlit expanse of the mountains. The jagged peaks of Eldarim stretched before him, bathed in an eerie, pale glow. For a brief moment, Cale allowed himself to feel the serenity of the scene, something he had not experienced in years. The battle that had haunted him, the war that had torn apart his soul, no longer gripped him with the same intensity. He had faced his demons, and while they still lingered, they no longer controlled him. He sheathed the blade at his side, its power humming faintly, like a distant storm on the horizon. There was no need to test its limits anymore. He knew what it could do, and he understood the consequences of wielding it recklessly. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Cale felt like he had a say in what came next. His future was not bound by his past. As he descended the mountain, his thoughts wandered to the war-torn lands he had left behind. The cities of Aranther still lay in ruin, remnants of the Silver Legion's conquest. The people who had once relied on him were scattered, broken, just like he had been. But now, with the power of the phantom blade in his grasp, there was something he could do. He couldn't rewrite the past, but he could help rebuild what had been lost. He could fight for the future. Days passed as Cale traveled the familiar roads that led him back to the heart of Aranther. The landscape had changed little since he had last left it, the same desolate fields, the same abandoned villages. Yet, to Cale, everything looked different. He no longer saw these places as mere reminders of his failure. They were now opportunities, places where new life could grow, where hope could be restored. As he approached the capital, Ithria, Cale's mind was focused on a singular purpose: dismantling the power of the Silver Legion. They had seized control of the land, their grip tightening over the years, but they were not invincible. Cale knew their weaknesses, he had fought them once, and he had learned from his mistakes. But this time, he had an advantage they could not foresee: the phantom blade. The city loomed on the horizon, its towering walls and fortifications standing as a testament to the Silver Legion's dominance. Cale slipped through the outskirts, his steps silent and deliberate. The city had become a fortress, with guards posted at every corner, their faces hardened by years of war. But Cale moved unseen, his training as an assassin serving him well. He had learned to navigate the shadows, and tonight, the shadows were his allies. His destination was the Black Tower, the heart of the Silver Legion's power. It was there that their leader, General Varys, held court. Varys, the man who had led the charge against Cale's people, the man who had orchestrated the massacre of the Blackthorn Brotherhood. Cale's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his blade as he thought of Varys, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was not about revenge. Not anymore. He reached the tower just as the last light of day faded from the sky. The streets were quiet, the city's inhabitants locked away behind their doors, afraid to venture out after dark. Cale slipped into the shadows of the alleyways, his movements precise and measured. The tower was heavily guarded, but Cale had been planning this for days. He knew the rotations of the guards, the weak points in their defenses. With the phantom blade in his hand, time itself bent to his will. He moved through the gaps in their patrols with ease, as if the world slowed down just enough to allow him passage. Inside the tower, the air was thick with the scent of burning torches and damp stone. Cale's eyes adjusted quickly to the dim light as he made his way up the spiral staircase. His heart pounded in his chest, but not from fear, from focus. Every step brought him closer to Varys, closer to the man who had set his life on this path of ruin and destruction. When Chaol reached the top floor, he found himself standing outside the door to Varys's chamber. He could hear the low murmur of voices from within, the unmistakable tone of command in Varys's voice. Chaol drew a deep breath and unsheathed the phantom blade, feeling its power course through him. He wasn't going to kill Varys out of vengeance. He was going to end him because it was necessary for the future of his people. The blade wasn't a tool of revenge, it was a weapon of justice that he pushed open the door. Inside, Varys stood at the head of a large table, surrounded by his top lieutenants. The room fell silent as Chaol stepped into the light, the phantom blade gleaming in his hand. Varys's eyes widened in recognition, but he quickly masked his surprise with a sneer. "Chaol," Varys said, his voice cold and mocking. "I thought you were dead." Chaol's grip tightened on the blade, but his voice was calm. "You missed your chance." Varys smirked, drawing his own sword from its sheath. "You think you can take me down, alone?" Chaol didn't respond. He didn't need to. The power of the phantom blade surged through him, and time slowed to a crawl. The movements of Varys and his lieutenants became sluggish, their reactions delayed by seconds that Chaol could exploit. He moved with the precision of a seasoned killer, striking before they even had a chance to defend themselves. In the span of a heartbeat, Chaol was behind Varys, the edge of the phantom blade resting against the general's throat. The room was still, the only sound the ragged breathing of Varys as he realized how close he was to death. "Your reign ends tonight," Chaol whispered, his voice steady. Varys's eyes darted around the room, but there was no one left to help him. His lieutenants lay on the ground, unconscious or dead. He was alone. "You'll never rebuild this land," Varys spat, his voice trembling with anger. "You're just as broken as the rest of them." Chaol pressed the blade against his throat, but not hard enough to draw blood. "I don't need to rebuild it alone. I just need to cut down the one standing in the way." For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Chaol could feel the weight of the moment, the finality of what he was about to do. He had traveled through time, seen countless versions of himself, each making different choices. But this was the one that mattered. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Chaol pulled the blade away, lowering it to his side. "You don't deserve to die by this sword," he said quietly. He turned and walked out of the chamber, leaving Varys standing alone, his pride shattered. The general's reign would crumble, and with it, the last vestiges of the Silver Legion's power. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. Chaol sheathed the phantom blade and gazed up at the sky. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. He had let go of the past, and now, the future was his to shape.